So, does anyone care to touch on this further?
Okay, this is where I need to interject for a moment because while I was stationed in England in the 80s, the Daily Mirror, and get this, check this out, and the Daily Sun, those two rags were always on base. They were everywhere. They were in every they were everywhere. I mean, more common than the National Enquirer in the United States. But yeah, as you can see, there's Rupert Murdoch with the first issue of the Sun on Sunday. They always had these page three girls. They were topless and young and generally busty. Anyway, uh, my name is Jerry. I left MAGA, and welcome back to my channel. I'm kind of taking things in a bit of a different direction, especially after having done that dissociative disorders versus schizophrenia. And I want to lean more towards that dissociative disorders thing and how that sort of disorder is based in trauma and how that trauma, how physical trauma in particular plays into the dissociation and dissociative disorders. Above and beyond any sort of doctrinal teachings or fear mongering or anything like that, I'm taking a direct path. So I'm doing a three-part I'm doing a three-part series, and they're all. This is going to be a big portion of the third part, but I want to lead in with this because yeah, we're gonna. This is where we're headed, but this, my friends, is where we're starting with Ghislaine Maxwell. I'm going to use her story as a cautionary example of how this leads to what we saw or are seeing being unveiled. So let's go ahead and get into this because this is a fairly lengthy read. It's going to take me about 45 minutes because it says it's about a 17-minute read. Um, Part two is about a half hour read. So that one's going to be really long. I got one piece of supplemental information to provide here as I'm working through this article just because of how this story actually intersects with my life in a very different way. But we'll get to that point. Anyway, and all the links will be in the description. Meet Ghislaine, Daddy's Girl. This is by Whitney Webb, originally published December 16th, 2021. Absent from the mainstream discourse on Ghislaine Maxwell's ongoing trial is any mention of the ties, not only of herself, but her family, to Israeli intelligence. Those ties, forged by Ghislaine's father, Robert Maxwell, are critical to understanding Ghislaine's history and her role in Jeffrey Epstein's sexual blackmail and trafficking network. And I'm just editing early because, yeah, algorithms and stuff. So the trial of Ghislaine, the alleged madam, and she ended up being convicted, of Jeffrey Epstein's blackmail and trafficking network, has attracted considerable mainstream and independent media attention, though not as much as one might expect, given the level of media attention that surrounded Epstein's 2019 arrest and death, or given the public interest in the Epstein Maxwell scandal and its broader implications, which 5 years later, here we are, almost 5 years later. Unsurprisingly, the broader implications of the Epstein Maxwell scandal have been largely, if not entirely, absent from mainstream media and some independent media coverage of Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, as well as absent from the case itself. For example, despite physical evidence of blackmail stored at Epstein's residences being shown by the prosecution, with the names of those incriminated being notably redacted, the prosecution chose not to mention even the potential role of blackmail in Ghislaine Maxwell's activities, and motives as it relates to her involvement in trafficking activities alongside Jeffrey Epstein. Not only that, but the names of Ghislaine's close contacts and even some of her defense witnesses, along with considerable information about her role in Epstein's network that is very much in the public interest, is due to the file under seal, or due to be filed under seal and forever hidden from the public, either due to details made between the prosecutor, I'm sorry, either due to deals made between the prosecution and the defense in this case, or due to rulings from the judge overseeing the case. Yeah, I think folks are understanding that sweetheart deal that was handed out. There's been a lot of folks been talking about that. Anyway, going hand in hand with the blackmail angle of this case and the specter of Ghislaine Maxwell's family ties to intelligence agencies, as well as the intelligence ties of Jeffrey Epstein himself, given that blackmail, particularly this other kind of blackmail, has been used by intelligence agencies, particularly in the US and Israel, since the 1940s and beyond. It is deeply troubling that neither the blackmail or intelligence angle has played any role in the prosecution case or in the mainstream media's coverage of the trial. To make, or I'm sorry, to remedy this lack of coverage, Unlimited Hangout is publishing a two-part investigative report entitled Meet Ghislaine, which is adapted from the author's upcoming book on the subject. This investigation will detail key aspects of Ghislaine Maxwell's links to intelligence agencies and blackmail activities that are relevant to the case against her and perhaps explain the silence from the prosecution and their interest in sealing potentially incriminating evidence against Ghislaine from the public scrutiny. Why would they do that? Why? Anyway, part one of this article will focus on Ghislaine's father, Robert Maxwell, a larger than life figure who straddled the worlds of both business and espionage, and whose daughters inherently di- inher- poo, and whose daughters inherited different aspects. You know what? Let me just try that sentence again. Part one of this article will focus on Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, a larger than life figure who straddled the worlds of both business and espionage, and whose daughters inherited different aspects of his espionage contacts and activities, as well as his influence empire following his 1991 death. So, making of a Maxwell. To understand Ghislaine Maxwell's history, one must start with a hard look at the rise of her father, Robert Maxwell. Born in what is now part of Ukraine, Robert Maxwell was the last in a series of names he used with Abraham Hawk, uh, Jan Ludwig, and Leslie Demure among his earlier aliases. The name Robert Maxwell emerged at the behest of one of his superiors in the British military. Maxwell had joined the British military during World War II, having left the village of his birth prior to the war, when the Third Reich began its expansion. Maxwell's parents and his siblings are believed to have died in the Holocaust. Robert Maxwell was involved with the British intelligence service MI6 during the war, and after the war was befriended by Count Friedrich van den Hugel, who, I'm sorry, Dr. Seuss. Anyway, Robert Maxwell was involved with the British intelligence service MI6 during the war, and after the war was befriended by Count Friedrich van den Hugel, who had worked closely with Alan Dulles during the war. All right, Alan Dulles is somebody else I'm working on a big piece on. Uh, anyway, moving on. Dulles went on to be the first director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and during the war. Actually, I think she's inaccurate there. I think Whitney got that. I double checked this, and I think actually Alan Dulles was third, but Alan Dulles was definitely the director of the CIA under Eisenhower, and Alan Dulles' brother John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president. So anyway, back to this. Let's see. Dulles went on to be the first director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Now he was OSS, and he was influential in getting the CIA established. And during the war, was busy running interference from prominent Nazis or for prominent Nazis, and actively undermining FDR's total surrender policy for senior Nazi leadership. Yes, that much is accurate. Okay, so that there's just that one detail there that I have a little bit of. Yeah, I had to relearn that part myself. Anyway, the chaos of post-war Europe allowed Maxwell to plant the seeds of what would become his future media empire. Thanks to his contacts with Allied forces in post-war Berlin, he was able to acquire the publishing rights for prominent European scientific journals, and in 1948, those interests were folded into the British publishing company Butterworth, which had long-standing ties to British intelligence. In the early 1950s, the company was renamed Pergamon Press, and this company became the cornerstone of Maxwell's media empire. We're going to get there. Pergamon's access to prominent academics, scientists, and government not only led to Maxwell acquiring great wealth, but also attracted the interest of various intelligence agencies, British, Russian, and Israeli among them, all of which attempted to recruit Maxwell as an asset or as a spy. When MI6 attempted to recruit Maxwell for service, it was concluded, after conducting an extensive background check, that Maxwell was a Zionist loyal only to Israel. Hmm, interesting. I think we see how that's trickled down, haven't we? His subsequent relationship with MI6 was choppy and largely opportunistic on both sides, with Maxwell later laying some of the blame for his financial troubles on MI6's alleged attempts to subvert him. Maxwell was not officially recruited to work for Israeli intelligence until 1961. But his crucial role in securing weapons and airplane parts for the 1948 war that created the State of Israel suggests a strong relationship with prominent politicians and military figures in the nation from its beginning, as this was certainly the case with other prominent businessmen who had helped arm Zionist paramilitaries before and during 1948. In the early 1960s, Maxwell was formally approached by the Israeli intelligence to make use of his access to the variety of prominent businessmen and world leaders that he had cultivated while growing his media empire. A few years later, a few years after being officially recruited as an asset of Israeli intelligence, Maxwell ran for public office, becoming a member of British Parliament for the Labour Party in 1964. His bid for re-election failed, which left him out of office by 1970. Around that same time, he also lost control of Pergamon Press, though he reacquired it a few years later. Having nearly lost everything, Maxwell devoted his time to consolidating control over his ever growing web of interlocking companies, trusts, and foundations that now encompassed much more than media concerns, while also developing his ties with prominent politicians, businessmen, and their fixers, a group that Maxwell proudly referred to as his sources. Among these early sources were soon to be Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Yeah, she was PM while I was over there, stationed over there. Continuing, Israelis or Israel's biggest arms dealer and one of its most powerful oligarchs, Saul Eisenberg, financial behemoths such as Edmund Safra, and master manipulators such as Henry Kissinger. Hmm. Yeah, I got him. He's on the list too. I'll get to him. Anyway, continuing. Another early source was George H.W. Bush, go figure, who was then part of the Nixon administration and soon served as CIA director before becoming Reagan's vice president and then U.S. president himself. Reagan was president while I was stationed in Europe, in England. Anyway, continuing. Maxwell's sources and influence extended well beyond the West, with many of his most prominent contacts found in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. He had cozy relationships with dictators, intelligence officers, and even organized crime lords such as Simeon uh, Mogilevic, sometimes referred to as the boss of the bosses of the Russian mafia. It was none other than Robert Maxwell who orchestrated the entry of uh, Mogilevich connected companies into the United States, a move that was accomplished for Maxwell successfully, or I'm sorry, a move that was accomplished, yes, after Maxwell successfully lobbied the state of Israel to grant Mogilevich and his associates Israeli passports, thereby allowing them easier access to U.S. financial institutions. Which brings into question why would Jeffrey Epstein need to reach out to the British government to get a Russian passport? Was Mangelson, who just got arrested yesterday, apparently. Today's February 24th, 2026. Apparently, England yesterday arrested Mandelson, the guy who helped Epstein get a Russian passport. Anyway, so where was I? Uh, yeah, passports. Like, yeah. So the expansion of Maxwell's prominent contacts paralleled the growth of his media empire. By 1980, he had acquired the British Printing Company Corporation, which he renamed the Maxwell Communication Corporation. A few years later, he bought the Mirror Group, publisher of the British tabloid The Daily Mirror. Okay, this is where I need to interject for a moment because while I was stationed in England in the 80s, the Daily Mirror, and get this, check this out, and the Daily Sun, those two rags were always on base. They were everywhere. They were in they were everywhere. I mean, more common than the National Enquirer in the United States. But yeah, as you can see, there's Rupert Murdoch with the first issue of the Sun on Sunday. They always had these page three girls. They were topless and young and generally busty. Anyway, um, so that's what I needed to interject there. While I was stationed in England working for Reagan's Air Force under the protection of Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of England, I'm consuming news articles and nudies from Rupert Murdoch and Robert Maxwell. Anyway, yeah, it was kind of mind blowing when I put all that stuff together. But continuing, this was followed by his acquisition of U.S. publishers Prentice Hall and Macmillan. And oh, that's maybe that's why those textbooks went downhill. Anyway, go back. This was followed by his acquisition of U.S. publishers Prentice Hall and Macmillan, and later the New York Daily News. Much of the money Maxwell used to acquire the Mirror Group and several of these other companies came from financial backers of Israeli intelligence, money borrowed from Maxwell owned media outlets such as the Mirror Group and its pension fund was used to finance Mossad activities in Europe and elsewhere. Then the funds were restored before the absence was noticed by the company employees not privy to those operations. Maxwell later derailed this well-oiled system by dipping into the same funds to finance his own ostentatious and salacious habits. Huh. During this period, Maxwell's ties to Israeli intelligence deepened in other ways, particularly uh, during the time when Yitzhak Shamir was prime minister. Shamir, previously a leader of the Zionist terrorist group known as Lehi or the Stern Gang, deeply loathed the United States, a sentiment he confided to to Maxwell during one of Maxwell's visits to Israel. Shamir told Maxwell that he blamed the Americans for the Holocaust because of the U.S. failure to support the transfer of European Jews to Palestine prior to the war. Shamir's views on the U.S. likely informed Israel's more aggressive espionage targeting in the U.S. that emerged during this time and in which Maxwell prominently figured. Maxwell and the Promise Affair. Maxwell's prominent roles in the Promise software scandal and the Iran-Contra affair during the 1980s were facilitated by his purchase of the numerous Israeli companies, several of which were either fronts or providers of services for Israeli intelligence. The most notable of these was Skytex, which Yitzhak Shamir's son, Nachum, was a major executive throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, and Degum, a computer company with a large presence in Central and South America as well as Africa. So I want to go back to this Maxwell being involved in the Iran Contra affair during the 80s, because prior to the Iran Contra affair was Operation Condor, which ran from 75 to 83. And there was probably an overlap of operations, but I find it interesting that Maxwell played prominent roles um, for Israeli intelligence in these arenas. So it's been a mess for a long time. Even before Maxwell's purchase at Degum, it had been used by Mossad as a cover for agents and particularly assassins who would use its offices as a cover before conducting kidnappings and murders of individuals linked to groups with ties to or sympathetic for Israel's enemies, particularly the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. Some of the most notable events occurred in Africa, where Mossad assassins used Begum as cover to launch killings of members of the African National Congress. In Latin America, Begum was also used as cover for the Mossad to infiltrate terrorist and narco-terrorist organizations, such as Peru's Sendero Luminoso, known in English as the Shining Path, and Colombia's National Liberation Army, or ELN. After Maxwell's purchase of Dagum, it served as the main vehicle through which Israel conducted what was arguably the most brazen and successful espionage operation of the era, the bugging and then mass marketing of the stolen software program known as Promise. Let's follow that link real quick. Spook Air to Lolita Express. Yes, we'll definitely get to that get to that another time. So moving along, Rafi, let's see, Rafi Eitan, the notorious Israeli spy master who served as Jonathan Pollard's handler and who played a key role in the creation of the Talpiot program, or Talpiot program, was serving as the head of the now defunct Israeli intelligence service known as Lechem when he heard of a revolutionary new software program used by the United States Department of Justice. The program was known as the Prosecutor's Information Management System, better known by its acronym Promise. I need to interject here because I remember covering back when I was a MAGA streamer. I remember finding out that Ashton Kutcher got caught trying to pass off some software to police departments that was linked back to the CIA, and it was supposed allegedly it was supposed to help network uh, uh, investigation materials for missing and exploited children. If you know anything about Ashton Kutcher, you know he's connected to Danny Masterson. You know where Danny Masterson is. You know Danny Masterson and uh, Ashton Kutcher and P Diddy are all linked. So I'm just going to move right along. Aitan had learned from a promise from Earl Bryan, a longtime associate of Ronald Reagan, who had previously worked for the CIA. Promise is often, I think she's referring to Earl Bryan, had previously longtime associate. Well, Reagan had worked for the CIA too. So anyway, um, yeah, I'm pretty sure she's talking about Earl though. That was bad editing. I'm sorry. Promise is often considered to be the forerunner of the PRISM software used by the U.S. and allied spy agencies today, and was developed by former NASA official Bill Hamilton. Bill Hamilton had leased the software to the U.S. Department of Justice through his company, Inslaw Inc., in 1982. I graduated high school and went active duty. Crazy stuff here. Ethan and Brian hatched a plan to install a trapdoor into the software, uh, a backdoor trapdoor, and then sell Promise throughout the world, providing Israel with invaluable intelligence on the operations of its enemies and allies, while also netting Ethan and Brian massive profits. According to the testimony of a former Israeli intelligence officer, Ari Ben Menashe, Brian provided a copy of Promise to Israeli military intelligence, which contacted an Israeli American programmer living in California. That programmer then planted a trapdoor or backdoor into the software. Once the backdoor was installed, Brian attempted to use his company, Hadron Incorporated, to market the bugged Promise software around the world. Having been unsuccessful at trying to buy out Inslaw, Brian turned to his close friend, Attorney General Ed Meese. Yes, we're talking Edwin Meese, whose Justice Department abruptly refused to make payments to Inslaw that were stipulated by contract, essentially using the software for free. Hamilton and Inslaw claimed that this was theft. Some have speculated that Misa's role in this decision was shaped not only by his friendship with Brian, but also by the fact that his wife was a major investor in Brian's business ventures. Misa's actions uh, forced Inslaw into bankruptcy, and Inslaw subsequently sued the Justice Department with the court finding that Meese led, I'm sorry, with the court finding that the Meese led department took, converted, and stole the software through trickery, fraud, and deceit. Meanwhile, with Inslaw seemingly out of the way, Brian sold the bugged software to Jordan's intelligence service, which was a major boon for Israel, and to a handful of private companies. Etan, nevertheless, was unsatisfied with Brian's progress and quickly turned to the person that he thought could most effectively sell Promise to governments of interest all over the world. Robert Maxwell. All right. Salesman and spy. Through Dagum and other fronts, Maxwell marketed Promise so successfully that Israeli intelligence soon had access to the innermost workings of innumerable governments, corporations, banks, and intelligence services around the world. Many of Maxwell's biggest successes came in selling promise to dictators in Eastern Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Following the sales, and after Maxwell collected a handsome paycheck, promise, with its unparalleled ability to surveil anything from cash flows to human movement, was used by these governments to commit financial crimes with greater finesse and to hunt down and disappear dissidents. Sounds like a precursor to Palantir, doesn't it? Anyway, in Latin America, Maxwell sold promise to military dictatorships in Chile and Argentina. It was used to facilitate the mass murder that characterized Operation Condor, as the friends and families of dissidents and so called subversives were easily identified using promise. Promise was so effective for this purpose. Just days after Maxwell sold the software to Guatemala, the US backed dictator rounded up 20,000 subversives who were never heard from again. And of course, thanks to the backdoor promise, Israeli intelligence knew the identities of Guatemalans disappeared before the victims' own families. Both the United States and Israel were also intimately involved in the arming and training of many of the Latin American dictatorships that had been sold the bugged promise software. It is worth noting that Israel's government and military industrial complex was simultaneously involved in selling arms to many of these same governments. Though Israeli intelligence immediately found obvious uses for the steady stream of sensitive and classified information, their biggest prize was yet to come. Aiton soon tasked Maxwell with selling promise to top secret U.S. government labs in the Los Alamos complex. Um, when I was stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, I was assigned to the Air Force Weapons Lab, and we did a lot of work up there at Los Alamos. Anyway, uh, Aiton soon tasked Maxwell with selling promise to top secret U.S. government labs in the Los Alamos complex, including Sandia National Laboratories, which was the civilian side of the Air Force Weapons Lab, basically, which was and is at the core of the U.S. nuclear weapons system, and so much more. In order to plot how he would accomplish such a feat, Maxwell met with none other than Henry Kissinger. We told him that he needed to enlist the services of Texas Senator John Tower, who was then head of the Senate Armed Services Committee. You guys, if you don't know how that sausage is made, this is how it's made. Kissinger has never been charged or even challenged for his role in facilitating a foreign espionage operation targeting highly sensitive U.S. national security information. Maxwell, using Mossad derived money, or I'm sorry, Maxwell, using Mossad derived money, paid Tower $200,000 for his services, which included opening doors, not just to the Los Alamos complex, but also to the Reagan White House. Promise was then sold to the laboratories through the U.S. based company that Maxwell had purchased in 1981 and transformed into a front for Mossad. That company, called Information on Demand, was headed by Maxwell's daughter, Christine Maxwell, beginning in 1985 until Robert's death in 1991, during which period she helped sell the bugged Promise software to several Fortune 500 companies. I thought it was Chinese hackers that were stealing all this stuff. Anyway, Isabel Maxwell, sister to Ghislaine and Christine, would also work at the company before its closure in 1991. After the attacks of September 11th, 2001, Christine Maxwell teamed up with uh, with CIA official Alan Wade to market Homeland Security software known as Chiliad to the U.S. national security state, while Isabel would work closely at the intersection between Israeli intelligence and its private technology sector around that same period. Ghislaine, along with her two intelligence and technology connected sisters, would hold a significant stake in a technology company that appears to be the actual origin of the Bill Gates Jeffrey Epstein relationship, as examined in the Unlimited Hangout investigation report from May. A few years after its acquisition by the Maxwells, Information on Demand was investigated by the FBI for its intelligence links beginning in 1983. However, that investigation was repeatedly shut down by the higher ups in the Meese-led Department of Justice, which, as previously mentioned, had been complicit in the whole sordid Promise affair. The investigation was shut down for good in 1985. The cover up, oddly enough, continues today, with the FBI still refusing to release documents pertaining to Robert Maxwell and his role in the Promise scandal. I promise you, we're getting ready to get to the Ghislaine stuff. At the time, the halting of the FBI investigation greenlighted Information on Demand's sale of Promise to Sandia National Laboratories, which provided Israeli intelligence with direct access to the core of the U.S. nuclear weapons programs and nuclear weapons technology. This was a boon for Israel's still undeclared trove of nuclear missiles and warheads and helped ensure that Israel would remain the only nuclear power in the Middle East. Israel's acquisition of nuclear weapons, seen in the light of the Promise scandal and the Pollard spy affair, shows that it was largely accomplished through trickery, deception, and espionage rather than Israeli technology or scientific prowess. The same year, 1985, is also when the CIA finally caught up with their Israeli equivalent and created its own backdoor into Promise, which it sold mostly to Allied intelligence services in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. It wasn't nearly as successful as Maxwell, who sold an estimated $500 million in bugged Promise software, bugged Promise programs for Israel. Good grief. The CIA, on the other hand, only sold around 90 million. So yeah, it looks like Robert Maxwell ran circles around the company. This is where things get really nasty. Heiress to an espionage empire. After Maxwell's wild success and promise on behalf of Israeli intelligence, he was recruited for another Israeli intelligence-driven operation, the Iran-Contra deal. It was through his Iran-Contra dealings that Robert Maxwell reportedly met Jeffrey Epstein, whom he brought into the fold of Israeli intelligence that same year, with the personal approval of the higher ups of Israeli military intelligence. The head of the Israeli military intelligence at that time was Ehud Barak, who later came under fire for his well documented and close ties to Epstein. The year 1985 was also the year when, conveniently enough, Epstein met Ohio billionaire Leslie Wexner and became intimately involved with his finances and affairs after Wexner's previous fixer, Arthur Shapiro, was shot in the face in broad daylight before he was set to testify to the IRS on matters related to Wexner's finances. Wexner would go on to co-found Mega Group in 1991, several prominent members of which have close ties to Israeli political and intelligence figures and or U.S.-based organized crime networks like the National Crime Syndicate. Epstein's entry into this world was facilitated through his romantic ties to Ghislaine Maxwell, which had allegedly preceded Robert Maxwell's successful efforts to bring him into the fold of Israeli military intelligence. Epstein was the only one of several boyfriends Ghislaine is said to have had in the 1980s, but Epstein was certainly the most similar in terms of both behavior and talents to her father. Ghislaine's other boyfriends, oh, by the way, that's Ghislaine and her mother, Betty. No, Betty doesn't look like a happy lady. Ghislaine's other boyfriends during or and prior to this period certainly deserve mention. One of the more interesting was an Italian aristocrat named Count uh, Gianfranco Ciscagna. Pardon me if I butchered that. I probably did. Whose grandfather was Mussolini's finance minister and the last Doge of Venice. Doge. Anyway, uh, Ciscagna also had ties to both covert and overt power structures in Italy, particularly to the Vatican, the CIA's presence in Italy, and the Italian side of the National Crime Syndicate. The other half of that syndicate, of course, was the Jewish American mob that, with its ties to the mega group, itself deeply connected to the Epstein scandal and whose members were frequent business partners of Robert Maxwell. It's worth noting that Gianfranco Ciscagna met a grisly end in 2012 when his plane was flying, when the plane he was flying exploded in a giant fireball during an air show, a morbid spectacle that can surprisingly still be viewed on YouTube. Oh my goodness, that actually kind of fits in though with the idea of this whole thing being the fuel behind a death cult. Wild. Anyway, Ghislaine and Robert Maxwell also had odd ties to the Harvard Proctor scandal in the United Kingdom, whereby a tabloid of Robert Maxwell's, with Maxwell's full approval, ran a story claiming that efforts were being made to blackmail Robert Maxwell with the information regarding Ghislaine's alleged relationship with the future Duke of Rutland. Maxwell clearly wanted the information linking Ghislaine to the Duke put out into the public sphere, but the story is odd for a few reasons. The motive of the blackmailer was ostensibly to prevent Maxwell owned papers from covering the Harvey Procter scandal, but the son of the Duke, who was allegedly involved with Ghislaine, was also a close friend and later the employer of Harvey Procter. The appearance of Harvey Procter, a conservative member of parliament, in this tabloid spectacle is interesting for a few reasons. In 1987, Procter pleaded guilty to sexual indecency with two young men who were 16 and 19 at the time, and several witnesses interviewed in that investigation described him as having sexual interest in young boys. Later, a controversial court case saw Procter accused of having been involved with well-connected British pedo and proctor of children Jimmy Savile. Russell Brand. Anyway, he was alleged to have been part of a child sex abuse ring that was said to include former UK Prime Minister Ted Heath. Savile's close relationship with Prince Charles of the British royal family is well known, and as will be mentioned shortly, Ghislaine is alleged to have been cozy with the royals before Prince Andrew's frequent public appearances with Ghislaine and Epstein, being around the year 2000 or beginning around the year 2000. Of course, the Maxwell owned papers in uh, covering the alleged affair or efforts. I'm sorry. Of course, the Maxwell owned papers in covering the alleged efforts to blackmail Robert Maxwell did not mention the young boys angle at all, instead focusing on claims that distracted them from the uh, the then credible accusations of preterism, by claiming that Proctor was merely into spanking and was whacking among other things. It's hard to know exactly what was going on in this particular incident, but the whole bizarre affair paints an interesting picture of Ghislaine's social circle at the time. In the same 1985 period, Ghislaine also became involved with philanthropy tied to her father's business empire by hosting a Disney Day Out for Kids and benefit dinner on behalf of the Mirror Group for the Save the Children NGO. Huh. Part of these words that keep coming back. We got to do it for the children, save the children. Anyway, uh, oh wow. Moving on. Part of the event took place at the home of the Marquis and Lady of Bath, a gala that was attended by members of the British royal family. It's worth noting that the Marquis of Bath at the time was an odd person, having accumulated the largest collection of paintings made by Adolf Hitler, and having said that Hitler had done great things for his country. Holy cow. The same evening, I've just been a long time since I've read this stuff. The same evening that the Ghislaine hosted bash concluded, the Marquis of Bath's son was found hanging from a bedspread tied to an oak beam and the Bath Arms in what was labeled a suicide. Attendance of royals and his Ghislaine hosted gala was not some lucky break for Ghislaine or her philanthropic effort, as Ghislaine had already been close to the royals for years, with subsequent employees and victims of Ghislaine having personally seen pictures of her growing up with the royals, a relationship allegedly facilitated by the Maxwell family's ties to the Rothschild banking family. Ghislaine was her. Ghislaine was heard on more than one occasion as describing the wealthy and influential Rothschilds as her family's greatest protectors, and they were also among Robert Maxwell's most important bankers, who helped him finance the construction of his vast media empire and web of companies and untraceable trusts. It was also during this period that Ghislaine learned with some I'm sorry. It was also during this period that Ghislaine learned some unusual skills, including how to pilot airplanes, helicopters, and submarines, and became fluent in several languages. Then, apparently in 1991, Ghislaine and her entire remaining family saw their fortunes shift dramatically, at least in public, with the death of Robert Maxwell, a death that most of the Maxwell family and most of his biographers regard as a murder, an act allegedly performed by the very intelligence agency that employed him. I have no doubts. That's kind of what my research shows. According to journalist John Jackson, who was present when Ghislaine and her mother Betty boarded her father's yacht shortly after his death, it was Ghislaine who coolly walked into her late father's office and shredded all incriminating documents on board. Ghislaine denies the incident, though Jackson has never retracted the claim, which was reported in a 2007 article published in the Daily Mail. If Jackson is to be believed, it was Ghislaine, out of all of Robert Maxwell's children, who was most intimately aware of the incriminating secrets of her father's financial empire and espionage activities. And yes, I agree that that would be the case. Closes out here with, as part two of this series will show, the evidence points to this being the case, particularly with Ghislaine's entry into New York's elite social circles, having been planned by her father before his death in 1991. Of course, those social connections in New York, as well as those in Europe and elsewhere, would prove instrumental in the operations and protection of Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking and blackmail network. Ghislaine's slippery behavior in the years that followed included activities both related to and unrelated to the trafficking of minors, show that Ghislaine inherited much more than her personality from her father, as she, along with several of her siblings, played a key role in keeping alive various aspects of her father's legacy, including his espionage activities. So it's in part two where we get into the intimate aspects of how Ghislaine was raised. Uh, anyway, this is some big stuff. This is some heavy stuff. But yeah, if you've made it to the end, kudos to you. It tells me that you're looking for some information, you're looking for some hard facts, and I'm going to bring you what I've got. Um, I'm open to discussion. I'm open to changing my mind. I mean, obviously, I changed my mind about some stuff. I mean, you can see right, I guess it's over there in that corner. I left MAGA. So I am capable of changing my mind. That said, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, get the rest you need, and keep track of those fluids.